I'm going to have Grandma Sue read the Valuetale books that we bought years ago when our children were just little tykes. Anyway, in these Valuetales, there's a couple of characteristics. They take a character from history, they tell their story with a specific attribute or quality or character that is positive. There's another aspect to these value tales, and that is there's always an imaginary friend to help them along in life. So now I'm going to ask Grandma Sue to start reading the story, The Value of Imagination, the story of Charles Dickens.
Once upon a time, long ago, there lived in England a little boy named Charles Dickens. Charles was a happy lad. He especially loved the stories his father told. In the evenings, his brothers and sisters sat listening to their father and sipping the hot lemon punch their mother made for them. Charles sat listening and dreaming grand dreams. When I grow up, Charles thought, I'm going to be a great storyteller too, just like my dad. Sometimes when Mr. Dickens wasn't telling marvelous stories, he took young Charles for long, rambling walks. Once, when he and Charles were out together, they came to a place called Gad's Hill, and there they stopped to admire a grand mansion there. Daddy, said Charles, someday I'm going to live in that house. Then Charles closed his eyes. He told his father exactly how grand it was going to be when he lived there. Mr. Dickens laughed. You have a great imagination, Charles, he said. Imagination? What does that mean? Asked Charles. Well, said Mr. Dickens, it means being able to take something real, like that house, and use it to make pictures in your mind of something that isn't real yet, like the way you think it will be when you live in that house. I see, said Charles. It's fun to use imagination. Of course it is, said his father. And they walked home. The little house where Charles lived with his family was not elegant like the mansion at Gad's Hill. Just the same, Charles liked his home very much. He also liked going over to the house next door where Mr. Giles lived. Mr. Giles had piles and heaps of books, and he was teaching Charles to read. But haven't you any books of your own? Mr. Giles asked Charles one day. Well, sir, I did once see some old books in our attic, said Charles, but I never looked inside them. Well, then, for goodness sake, hurry home and look into them, cried Mr. Giles. See what's waiting for you in your own attic. Charles ran off as fast as he could, thinking, I wonder what I will find. He trotted into his own house and climbed up the stairs. He threw open the attic door, and there were the books. I wonder how they got here, said Charles to himself. They look so old and dusty, but maybe if I clean them off, I'll find some good ones. My dear little chap, said a strange small voice, of course you'll find some good ones. Charles jumped, and he almost cried out with fright. I beg your pardon, young man, said the little creature who had come out from behind a row of books. I didn't mean to startle you. Well, who are you? Asked Charles. My name is B.W., said the little creature. That's short for bookworm. And what, Charles asked, is a bookworm? The little creature explained that a bookworm is a worm that lives in books and eats their pages. I see, said Charles politely, but I never knew that a worm could talk. Are you real, B.W., or did I make you up? Sometimes I do make things up. I thought so, said the bookworm, and he laughed. Charles knew then that he had imagined the bookworm just as he had imagined living someday in the big house on Gad's Hill. But it was fun to imagine, and Charles decided that he wouldn't stop. Tell me more about yourself, he said to B.W. I'm a very special bookworm, said B.W. I never eat the printed part of a page. I only nibble on the white part at the edges. That way I can always go back and read what's in the book. And that way I meet some very interesting characters. Characters, asked Charles. What are characters? Characters, my curious young friend, are the people who live in books, said B.W. Some of them are quite enchanting. Look around and you'll see. Young Charles looked around the attic, and suddenly it was crowded with people who seemed to appear out of the books that were piled on the shelves. That's Robinson Crusoe, cried B.W. I know him. There's Don Quixote. And see those sheiks over there? They're from the Arabian Nights. B.W. knew them all because he had read all the books in the attic. What fun, said Charles. Books are fun, Charles decided, and using my own imagination to pretend about things is fun too. True, said B.W., but let me warn you, young sir, that life demands more of you than imagination. Simply sitting on a curb and dreaming about great houses is a sure way to get nowhere. But when you do some real work, it's much more likely that your dreams will come true. Charles went downstairs with little B.W. tagging along, and he began to help his mother. See, it's not so bad, said B.W. In fact, work really is a kind of fun, too. But as much as the Dickens children helped out around the house, it wasn't enough. Something terrible was happening to the Dickens family. What do you think it was? Tomorrow, we'll continue with Charles Dickens, The Value of Imagination.